Hi there, I'm Flynn, the editor of the Post and Courier's Education Lab. I'm here today with two of our senior reporters, Maura Turcotte and Sarah Gregory, who many of you, if you attended our last Behind the Headlines, have already met. And Maura just joined our lab from the New York Times and moved here from California. So, Maura, do you want to say hi and introduce yourself a bit?
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Maura. Yeah, I'm from LA originally, and yeah, I spent the last 2 years, or just short of 2 years, working at the New York Times, helping report COVID for them. And for a good year of that, I was mainly focusing on the spread of the virus in correctional facilities and detention centers. So that involved everything from calling up felt like nearly every jail in the country to get the data on cases at each facility, and it also involved things like speaking with incarcerated individuals and their families to hear about what was actually being done to stop the spread of the virus. But I'm very excited to be reporting here in South Carolina now about education.
And you came just in time for all our snow warnings. So
Exactly.
Welcome to the state. And for those of you who weren't at our last Behind the Headline, we also have Sarah Gregory, who came from the Virginian Pilot. Sarah, do you want to talk a bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, like Hillary said, I've been a reporter covering education for about a decade now, most recently in Virginia, and I am very excited to be here.
And we're here today because we want to give you a behind the scenes look at some of the stories that we've been reporting on. The first of which that we're going to be discussing today is about how many educators are leaving the field. Maura has spoken to dozens of teachers across the state and found out, just hearing stories about their experiences teaching during the pandemic, and especially during this fall, and she recorded their struggles and triumphs in a story where we dubbed teachers our newsmakers of the year for 2021 that came out in December. And we'll also be talking about how other educators like superintendents have been leaving their positions too. After that, Sarah is going to talk about a piece that she also published in December. We had big pieces in the same week. About how last minute budget provision really upended the start of the school year by banning school districts from issuing mask mandates. She did a really deep dive into that whole entire process, so she can give us the inside look at that. And then she's also going to talk to us about the Omicron variant and how it's been disrupting the school since the start of the new year. But to start out with, Maura, can you talk to us a bit about the teachers you spoke to and just what the whole process was like, finding them, reaching out to them, and a couple of things you learned?
Yeah, definitely. I think, to begin, whenever we, towards the end of the year, there's always some interest on reflecting back on the past events of the last 12 months. And even as someone who wasn't directly reporting on teachers and schools previously, I was very aware, as I'm sure as most of the country was, of all the drama going around schools, whether that was, reopening schools or grades slipping or masking. And so I thought, December was just a great time to kind of reflect back on all of that and kind of connect with teachers to see what they had dealt with and what they're still dealing with as we move into a new year. And so to report this story as a new reporter in the state, I really had to rely on any connections I could find, and just kind of network with fellow reporters or groups like education associations, or reaching out to school districts to kind of see if they knew of any teachers who would be, willing to share their reflections with me. So it kind of just involved a lot of looking at under every stone and every rock to see who I could connect with.
You also found during that story you talked to them a bit about their past working as educators and some systemic issues that existed within South Carolina's education system. And Did you find like the pandemic created new problems, or did it exacerbate already existing problems, or what was your sort of takeaway from all your interviews?
Yeah, there were, I mean, a lot of issues came up, and like, in my story, I didn't even get to touch upon all the issues I heard. But I think one of the biggest takeaways, and one thing that I kept hearing from like almost every teacher, was like all these issues that they brought up were very much present beforehand. But I heard a lot about just like teachers having to like juggle an increasing workload, and the way the pandemic exacerbated that was like, they were suddenly having to think about like camera angles for, teaching students who were maybe quarantining at home, or, they were having to keep track of, oh, here's a student returning back to in-person learning. What work do they need to make up? What work am I expecting them to turn in? Things like that. And then I also heard teachers who like, they were still trying to like foster and develop connections with students and parents as, things were remote or kind of hybrid. So they were like overextending their schedule sometimes, making sure they were available from like 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. at night, so that parents and students can ask questions. And so there was just a lot to juggle. But that was all like that, difficulty in juggling everything had been present before the pandemic. And, the data kind of shows that, South Carolina has really struggled with teacher retention rates. And as a result, in the September and October of 2021, there were like 1,060 teacher positions that were just vacant. And that was, I believe, a 50% increase from the year prior. So it's been an issue, but the pandemic has definitely really exacerbated it.
Absolutely. And besides those major issues, like, was there anything else you picked up over the course of your reporting? Just like any little nuance type things?
Yeah, there was. I mean, one thing that I thought was really interesting was just like the gap in like, there were learning gaps, obviously, and that has been talked about, but there was, a lot of teachers spoke about the gap in like social emotional skills. Like I spoke with one teacher who, she like it was like they were freshman students, and it was the first assignment of the year, and she had them like do group work together, and they were just like sitting there silent. So like there's clearly a lot to like address. It's not just like the academic grades, there's also just like, kind of developing these students as like persons and their personalities, and like making sure they like can, kind of develop into them full selves. So there's a lot more to balance now.
That especially shows like the important roles of educators right now and just how many hats we have to juggle. We've started getting some questions, and everyone, as a reminder, we do have a question and answer box where you can post any questions you have for us. But we have one from a woman, Julie Ritchie, who she's asking you, Maura, how did you select the educators that you interviewed? I know that you talked about how you got this, like you worked on this piece when you were new to the state, that you were reaching out to a lot of people, but and you talked to so many different teachers, but you do ultimately have to decide to highlight only a handful of stories, or sometimes even less. Can you talk about why you decided to highlight the stories you did? And then also anything about the stories that you weren't able to convey in the piece?
Yeah, I mean, it was very hard. And I mean, so I spoke to everyone who said they were willing to speak to me. And so I think I ended up speaking to like a dozen teachers. But yeah, like you said, I did have to like narrow it down for who I could highlight in the piece. And I think I ended up highlighting just like 4 teachers in total. And why I chose the ones I did, they like often had like they shared points that I think encapsulated a lot of other people's stories too. They just had maybe had slightly like more like stronger anecdotes, or like I just I thought their anecdotes were a little more powerful. Not to say like no one had less powerful anecdotes, but I think it was just
Yeah,
kind
but
of,
it's also like the specificity, right? Like if someone's able to tell you like how, because there are so many moments and it's been so overwhelming. So if someone's able to give you like so much detail about a specific thing that happened, like that's easier to put into a story.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, I wanted to like highlight things that like I was seeing and hearing through other people's reporting of like these were common issues that other teachers were facing, rather than highlight someone who had like a very unique experience and that was like completely different, but then like that doesn't relate to what any other teacher in the state maybe dealt with. Yeah.
Perfect. We have more questions already. So we have one from Shamitra Graves asking you what parents can do to help educators right now. So, Maura, you've had from like all your extensive conversations, like what are ways parents could help at this time?
Yeah, I don't know if there's like a clear and defined answer to this, of course, as with everything, but I do think from my discussions and conversations with educators, like I think they often feel like they're not being understood in terms of like the like maybe concerns they may have in returning to classrooms, or like the difficulties they have in juggling all their work. And so I think just as a first step, I think a lot of everyone, whether you're a parent or not a parent, like should just like kind of bring some understanding to teachers and like try to understand their situations and maybe the difficult positions they're in. But I also think getting involved is very important too. And I know that's not always possible for every parent, whether that's because of busy schedules or whatnot, but if you can, I would get involved, whether that's like a PTA or volunteering or even just like meeting with teachers. Because like, not only is that an opportunity to like, voice your concerns, voice your perspectives, hear what's like the decision-making process, but also like there is like a lot of studies showing that like parent involvement improves, student success. So I think that's a good start.
And Sarah, just from your time reporting both here and back in Virginia during the pandemic, like, do you have any advice on this question, especially because it is so important, about what parents can do to help assist educators, or just any takeaways generally?
I mean, I think I would just add to what Maura said about just extending educators grace. I think everyone can look in their own lives, and the last 2 years have been stressful for everyone, but teachers have really been asked to like transform, what they do, sort of on a, overnight in some cases, if you think back to the very early days of the pandemic. And so, I just think generally like extending grace, reaching out to teachers if you have a question and not jumping to conclusions. I see a lot of, like chatter on social media of like, why did so-and-so do this or that? And sometimes the person has never even talked with the teacher and asked them. And I think sometimes there's like really simple explanations if you just talk to people, and sort of share your concerns and approach that with, compassion and empathy.
Also, we have another question right now from Kyle Moores, who's asking us, is there anything being done at the state level to mitigate the staffing problem in our schools without compromising the quality of education provided for our children? I know legislators are trying to address this issue, and they're also very aware that in their attempts to address this issue, they're kind of chipping away at it rather than doing a complete overall haul at this time. Just yesterday, I know the Education Subcommittee in the Senate heard 2 bills and passed them. One was to give students, mandating that elementary schools in the state had to give teachers a 30-minute uninterrupted break, and the other one made it easier for uncertified teachers to teach classes in different districts. And while uncertified teachers teaching classes like does sound scary kind of. They do have a lot of, like, a good amount of regulations for it. They have to have, they're considered experts like in like a specific field or subject matter that they're teaching. So they need to have a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in the subject that they're going to be teaching and 5 years of relevant work experience to it. They also need to enroll in an alternative educator program within 2 years, and they do receive classroom training. Also, so teachers are leaving the field, but they're not the only educators leaving during the pandemic. We have seen 19 superintendents in South Carolina leave their jobs since the start of the pandemic in March 2020. And while we reported on this, something that we found that was really interesting is while that does seem like a lot, it's actually not that out of the norm for the turnover for superintendents nationwide. We found out that according to like the average rate of turnover nationally is actually 14 to 16%, and this number like fits into that bracket. But we did hear basically the main issue that's facing like the superintendent space right now is that there is a pipeline problem, because as many of those attending this chat know is that the typical way people become superintendents is they become teachers, then principals, and then superintendents. But right now, if we do have a teacher shortage, that does sort of dry up those teachers that could be superintendents in the future. But to move on to another topic, Sarah, you reported extensively about a rule that was slipped into this year's budget at the last minute by a junior member of the legislature that bans school districts from mandating masks. So Sarah's story, as a bit of background, was an incredibly deep look at how this provision got passed, and then how it was really just kind of like allowed to function as part of the, like, as a budget rule for several months that did like very much upend the start of the school year. So can you talk a bit about your reporting process, especially like how did this provision get through the budget process in the first place?
Yeah, so to sort of set the scene, when lawmakers started taking up this budget rule, it was early June. Cases were at the lowest they'd been since the start of the pandemic. I talked to, a bunch of legislators who said, we really thought that, the worst was behind us, and they were optimistic that the types of mitigations and precautions that schools had taken in the last, in the year before that those wouldn't be needed in the fall. And so that was sort of the context that they were hearing this. But there wasn't really a whole lot of debate. So when it gets brought up in the House, you have a couple, two Democrats who raise concerns about it, saying, we think this is something that should be left to local school boards to decide, not the state. But there's really not that much discussion, and it goes to the Senate. It doesn't seem like, everyone there was even aware that it was, in the budget, and then it gets, passed into law in the budget and goes into effect July 1. And so starting July 1, districts are told by the state, you can't have a mask mandate. And so that's sort of the context that, all these districts sort of start planning for the fall with, is knowing this is not something we can use.
And you mentioned that like this vote was very much like across party lines. We actually have a question from an anonymous attendee that said, in addition to the overload burnout, did you find that the polarized political atmosphere that has trickled down to school boards impacting, and has it impacted teachers? And with this ban on mask mandates, do you think that is something that like really impacted teachers and people in the education space this fall?
Absolutely. So I think Maura mentioned this earlier. I mean, you've got teachers who, some of them are older, some of them have health conditions that make them particularly susceptible to the virus. There are a lot of older school buildings that don't have the best ventilation. And so there were a lot of real fears about taking away what many feel was the best mitigation measure. And it just, it's still what the CDC recommends, that schools, they recommend universal masking. So there was real concern about that. And, when I talked with, I talked with an administrator in Pickens County up here in the upstate. I'm based in Greenville. When I talked with this administrator, that was one of the things that, after school started and they started seeing cases going up, they started talking about like, well, should we impose a mask mandate? And one of the reasons they decided not to was that they didn't want to put teachers in the middle of having to sort of police this. Like they didn't want a student to be in a position of, showing up to school without a mask. Maybe their parents don't believe that they need to wear a mask. And they didn't want teachers to be the ones that are sort of trying to arbitrate that in real time. They felt like that was an additional stress to teachers that they just didn't want to put on them. So yeah, definitely has trickled down to the classroom.
And obviously, like the story that you wrote about was really during when the Delta variant was spreading across the country. And now there's a new variant, that again is impacting schools. Can you talk a bit about what you're seeing with the recent rise in Omicron cases? I know that you've been reporting about the numbers of quarantine, school closures, and things DHEC has been releasing. And I was hoping that you could just talk about what's happening with Omicron generally, and then how it's differing from when the Delta variant spread throughout the state.
Yeah, so I think a lot of educators really hoped that after the Delta peaks in late August and September, that was going to be the time where we could sort of put the pandemic behind us. And then towards the end of December, you started seeing Omicron spreading, and it has spread really quickly. So, the first week back, you started hearing that districts were having issues with staffing. And then really the second week that we were back, that schools were back in January, you started seeing massive closures, just, left and right. I keep a spreadsheet to track these things. And there were times when I would, finish adding schools to the spreadsheet that were on the state's website. And then I would refresh the state's website, and there were more in the time it had taken me to add them. So there were a lot of closures. So during Delta, there were 233 schools that ended up going virtual. During Omicron, so far, we've seen 225 since the start of January. So in terms of school closures, it's about the same number of schools. I think the thing that we've heard about a lot in the last few weeks are just the staffing issues. And so one thing that DHEC has done is what we're hearing from schools is they just don't have the staff to, run schools safely, because so many teachers and other staff, bus drivers, substitutes are sick or they're quarantining. So one of the things that DHEC did over the MLK holiday was put out new guidance that lets staff who have, it sort of relaxes the requirements and allows them to keep working if there's crisis situations. And you've seen a number of school districts adopt that. And if you look at the number of school closures right now, it's, I think there's 5 schools at the moment across the state that are closed. So the numbers have dropped substantially in the last week. I think some of that was potentially helped by the weather last week. Schools were closed, and so kids were home, and because a lot of folks were snowed in, there wasn't really the socializing that has happened like during other school breaks, like around the holidays. So we're seeing a lot fewer school closures this week than we have earlier in January, and I'm sure educators hope it stays that way.
But even as we see less school closures, like obviously like this has had an impact on children's education in the classroom and like morale too. Sarah, can you talk a bit about what you've been hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's like different about Omicron is that like with every wave, teachers and parents and students are just a little bit worn down by everything else. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hitting people hard. I was talking with an administrator earlier this week about sort of some of the ways that they're having to cope. And there's a term I hadn't heard before, sprinkle, which is, when a teacher's out and there's not a sub to cover the class, you sprinkle the students into other classes so that, another teacher can watch those students. But that's obviously incredibly disruptive for those students. It's disruptive for the teacher who now has, a couple more students who she's supposed to help. And so all of those things, I mean, I think what you're hearing is that schools are doing the best they can to stay open, but it's having a big impact.
And one thing that's also like on a more positive note is that our state has received a good amount of money through the American Rescue Plan. I know, Sarah, that you've been looking into those funds and everything. We have a question from one of our attendees from IDE. He wants to know, did you get a sense of whether the American Rescue Plan or any of the congressional relief funds directed to schools have made an impact on the daily lives of students and teachers? So can you both answer that question? And then can you also just talk about what you're seeing with where that money is going in general, like the process of school districts submitting and budgets and those getting approved, just what's going on with those funds?
I can start. So there's been 3 rounds of stimulus funding that South Carolina and other states have received. The first round in particular, and somewhat the second round, a lot of that went to it was in the early days of the pandemic, it went to PPE and to like cleaning, sanitizing, like that sort of thing, those costs. The third round of funding is the largest, and that's what districts, they spent last summer sort of planning how they would use it. They have until 2024 to spend down the money. At this point, districts have submitted their plans. Last I checked, there's still a couple that are waiting on approval from the state. But generally, with this round of funds, there's a lot of latitude given to districts about how to spend this money. They have to spend 20% on learning loss. And some of them are spending significantly more than that, but at a minimum, you have to spend 20%. And after that, sort of after like academic recovery and sort of like summer school programs, after school tutoring, weekend programs, after that, the biggest chunk of the money is going towards improving facilities. So HVAC replacements, roof replacements, things that should help improve ventilation in buildings. So it sort of depends. A lot of the money has not been spent yet. So that's something we're watching really closely.
George Temple also had a question for you, Sarah. Are teachers asking for support and resources from the ESSER funds? Like, are you seeing a lot of those resources going towards improving teacher retention or just making teachers' jobs easier?
So we're definitely seeing some of the funds, like some of the plans talk about buying new curriculum and things like that, that are, I think, intended to help teachers. I'm less familiar with like the specific things that teachers are asking for. I mean, part of the process that districts had to go through last year was to solicit feedback from stakeholders, of which teachers would be considered, in that group. So districts should be asking teachers, what would help with this. I think one of the other things that we're seeing nationally being sort of advice given to districts about how to use this money is to supplement pay. So just in recognition of the fact that teachers are taking on, in many cases, extra workloads as a result of the pandemic, boost pay. This is one-time funding, so it's not, districts don't usually like to give raises with one-time funding, but giving like bonuses and things like that, can help support teachers.
And Maura, is that something that you heard too a lot? Like, I know that there have been systemic problems with teacher pay in the state, but especially with their added workload, like, do you hear many complaints about their salaries, lack of bonuses, et cetera?
The teachers that I spoke with didn't get too much into those details, but I mean, I think generally speaking, I did hear just some like, I think it's like the stress of like, having a growing workload and you're all doing it on a very small salary. Like I believe in South Carolina, there was a study that found that the average salary for teachers here is 53,000, which is 10,000 less than the national average. So it's like we're like seeing increasing responsibilities for teachers and they're still doing it all in this like relatively small salary. So yeah, I didn't hear someone say like I need a whole lot of extra money, but I heard discomfort about how much they were being paid.
Perfect, or well, not perfect, of course, kind of the opposite. But thank you guys so much for attending, both Maura and Sarah, and then also all our attendees who have come to see behind the headlines today. We really appreciate it. And of course, if you have any more questions, please reach out to the lab. We're going to be sharing both all our emails, our Twitter handles, everything. We are really we really want to hear from teachers, parents, just people who care about education in the state of South Carolina for future stories, or even to help us generate ideas for future stories. So please, oh, and again, while this is a live session, it is being recorded. So if if you have friends who are educators who were not able to attend this live, please send them the recording or remind them that there is a recording that they can watch anytime. And again, thank you so much for coming.